Hello and welcome to another Unclecthulu video. This is the second part of my 1745 thoughts, and I'm going to talk about the Battle of Culloden. So in my first video I talked a bit about Decision Point Derby and what potentially could have occurred if Bonnie Prince Charlie had gone on to London, in my opinions. Now I think by the time the Battle of Culloden happened, the Jacobean cause was, in a conventional sense, doomed. They lost all the major ports in Scotland apart from Inverness. They had to hold Inverness for the French reinforcements and supplies to get through, which were already being interdicted by the Royal Navy anyway. The other thing the loss of Inverness would have done would have caused a loss of prestige amongst the clansmen and the United Kingdom as a whole to Prince Charlie's cause. So basically it was a battle he probably shouldn't have fought, but he felt he had to fight. Now what I'm going to look at is the key advantages that the British Army had at the Battle of Culloden and talk about the options, in my opinion, that the Jacobeans had to negate them. Still think, even with the advantage is dealt with, it would have been a hard fought battle for the clansmen and the Jacobean army. It wasn't just a Highland army. There was at least 750 Irishmen there, Frenchmen there, the remains of the English volunteers that were there, and the clansmen themselves. So we've seen at Falkirk, by which point the Jacobean army couldn't turn that into a decisive victory in the same way that it had at Prestonpans. But the Highlanders were still able to outfight a British army, as seen at Clifton Moor during the retreat north. So, key things that the British had, the government forces had on their side at the Battle of Culloden. Terrain. Now, there was a giant swamp in front of and to the right of the British lines. Now, the day before the battle, the Jacobites had control of the battlefield. They knew what the battlefield was about, and actually their initial deployment zone would have been the British line. But they'd managed to mess up a night assault, and in their return to Culloden Moor, they were followed by the British, and the Jacobite forces deployed past the swamp, the marshy ground, so that was between them and the British army. Actually, the British position would have been a great position for a Jacobite army to have deployed on. Could have had the River Nairn guarding one flank and the marshy ground the other flank, protecting them from cavalry. So we'd have produced a wall. You also were slightly uphill, so you'd have had the advantage of being able to charge downhill with the Highland charge whilst your flanks were covered. The ground itself was also whilst it was still muddy and wet from the sleet and rain that they'd had, it was still relatively solid. Now, the reason they give up the terrain kind of ties into another one, which was the relative fatigue of the armies and the supply. The British army, the government army, was well supplied. It had just spent a day resting and celebrating the Duke of Cumberland's birthday. So it was well supplied, well provisioned, and it was capable of operating at peak efficiency. Now, the Highlanders were on starvation rations, the supply routes had broken down, which meant they were on approximately a biscuit a day plus whatever else it could scavenge. And they'd just been on a night march, which was aborted when the two sides of the army lost track of each other, and that came back to Culloden. When they came back to Culloden, they deployed further on the moor than they wanted to, hence the marsh in between. But actually, the relative fatigue of the armies was almost forgotten. The fact that the flank of the Highland charge were able to get in says a lot about how up for the fight they were. The other flanks floundered in the marsh. That was bound to happen. Now, to overcome this disadvantage, what if the Highlanders had stayed on the moor and picked a clan regiment, maybe even 300, 400, 500 Highlanders to go and harass the government forces at night? So they maintained control of the battlefield. They chose the ground they'd fight on, plus they had the advantage of the clansmen being skilled in irregular fighting, small units, operating skirmishing, which is how the clans would have fought in smaller groups. Night raiding sent those to harry and harass the government forces. Those 500, I'd say 300 maybe, those troops wouldn't necessarily need to rejoin the battle line. The effect on the government forces would have been to put them at disarray. The government forces' morale was pretty good. These were regiments pulled from Europe, where they'd been fighting. So their discipline and morale was high. But the British Army hadn't really defeated a Highland charge yet. So a night of terror from Highlanders and chaos and havoc would have played hell with their morale and made them a bit jittery. So if they'd have came to Culloden Moor, they'd have been a bit more jittery, a bit more on edge. The Highlanders would have known what was happening. The Jacobite army was in ground of their choosing, which would have counted for a lot. However, the battle itself, the British drill and discipline was superb. The regiments did exactly what they needed to do. The first line held, basically 2 British regiments were engaged. The ones further along covered by the swamps, marshes weren't. 2 British regiments that were engaged, approximately 800 men, 2 regiments, 350, 400 each were engaged, and they suffered 250 wounded, 50 dead, yet held and allowed the second rank to support them. And I think the Highlanders would have just, if everything had still been in their favour with the night march and the terrain, I don't think the Highlanders would have been able to break the first British line and follow through and took the second British line. Like I say, the army that they faced at Prestonpans was a hodgepodge of garrison units, not first-rate redcoat units, and that army broke. Like I say, this was European first-rate troops that they were facing. Like I say, I think the Highlanders could have engaged the first line. I don't think they'd have broke it. I think the second line would have held. It would have been a tough battle. And that's with the Highlanders being able to choose the ground. And the only tipping point might have been with the morale, if they'd have managed to really rattle the redcoats during the night, if they'd had a smaller incursion with a mandate to harass, cause havoc. Because ultimately the big British advantage was numbers. They had about 8,000 troops to 5,000 Jacobean troops, and drill. And actually, the Duke of Cumberland had been drilling the troops to stay in line. That's what drill's about. Drill's about getting you to stay in line, keep formation, keep firing, keep bayoneting effectively at close quarters. Now, actually, close quarter fighting was something which was quite unusual for armies of that period. Generally, you'd march to within range and just hammer muskets on one side. Morale failed and you'd fled. So what the Duke of Cumberland had done is made sure that the Allied troops, the government troops, were all Allied, because it was British, there were Dutch regiments, there were English regiments, Scottish regiments, but it's government force. It was made sure that their drill was good, so when the Highlanders hit, they were able to repel, to fight. A lot's been said about the new drill where you would skewer the man to your right because the Highlanders target, etc. I don't think that was as significant as some history books would say, above and beyond good drill. And actually, it was probably the way to fire from the second line, being able to hammer the Highlanders as it broke through, which blunted the Highlanders attack. And there was about 700 Highlanders dead in the area where they engaged the two British Redcoats. Now, I suspect a lot of those would have been as the Highlanders withdrew. That's a critical time for an army. That's when you're going to suffer more casualties than in the front lines. So, but if you think about it, in terms of casualty rates, where the Highlanders hit the line, we had of approximately 800 in the two regiments, we had 250 wounded and 50 killed approximately, so say 300. You're almost looking at a 50% casualty rate for that front line. So if the whole of the Highland front line had been able to engage, you might be looking at a British army which had a loss of up to 1,000 men, as long as the second rank held its line. And I believe it did have the drill and discipline to hold it. Now, there were a couple of other options open to the Jacobites that the General Murray suggested. One of them was to not fight in Culloden. Well, there were three basic options: not fight in Culloden, pick another ground, pick ground which is best chosen. Certainly, we've seen the Highlanders do this at Falkirk, at Prestonpans, where they redeploy their army. So we know the Highland army were capable of that. Probably he was talking about crossing the river. The second option would have been to fall back into Inverness and suffer a siege, and I think that would have been the worst of all possible options for the Highlanders. You'd have stripped out the Highlanders' chief weapon, which was their charge, and in a grinding siege warfare of a cannon, artillery, well-provisioned army sieging them, I don't think the Highlanders, it would have ruined Highland morale, and the rest of Scotland wouldn't have rallied to the cause. The third option is really interesting. Third option probably would have been the most effective for the Highland cause, but not necessarily for the Jacobean cause, which would have been to retreat back into the Highlands, disperse your forces into penny packets, run a guerrilla war against the British. This would have tied down a significant portion of the British army and give European allies a chance to intervene or do something significant in Europe to cause the British to... Nobody likes fighting on two fronts. I think it would have caused the government forces to be overstretched. And actually it would have played up to the Highland ways of fighting. Certainly at the Battle of Killiecrankie, the Highlanders had made great use of ambush tactics to defeat our government force. The Earl of Montrose fought a very long campaign during the English Civil War with a smaller army, using manoeuvrability, terrain, to be able. Sorry, I'm getting interruptions into my video there. To be able to hold off a larger Covenanter force. So certainly that would have given the Highlanders a chance to fight the war on their terms. For for Boniface Charlie, it wouldn't have done him what he wanted to do. He wanted the people to proclaim him king. He wanted to win his kingship in a traditional sense of way. For him, skulking in the Highlands wasn't an option. The other thing, what would have occurred, is it's reckoned that the Highland fighting forces was approximately 32,000 men, of which we saw about 3,000 Highlanders at Culloden fighting for the Bonnie Prince, and we had 3,000 to 4,000 Highlanders on the government forces in various capacities. If the army had gone into the Highlands and had to fight against a guerrilla campaign and use the tactics to repress the population, of which they're certainly able to after the battle, it's estimated that 30,000 people lost their lives as a direct result of government atrocities post the Battle of Culloden. That would have rallied more Highlanders to the cause. It would have increased sympathies. It would have changed the image of the savages coming out the Highlands to prey on the lowlands. And if it had been reported, obviously propaganda is a key part of war, but the people in the Highlands would have wanted to have resisted the government. And if the stories had got out about the atrocities going on, which would have occurred, then maybe that would have changed other sympathies for the rebellion. Certainly it would have had the rebellion perhaps last long enough for significant French involvement to have occurred. Certainly that's the sort of thing we saw in the Americas, except for in the Americas it was almost a reversal of the Jacobite rebellion. The rebellion suffered some significant losses to begin with, apart from Bunker Hill. Was able to hold in there, pull a force together, and then hold out long enough for European intervention to be able to tip the balance in favour of the new republic. Certainly for the Highlanders, it would have been perhaps the best way to get a different outcome to what occurred. Like I say, I'm not sure a pitched battle that they could have won it. They could have stacked the odds in their favour. They could have had another Falkirk type where it was a bit of a bloody stalemate on the ground. Certainly a siege in Inverness would have been the end of the Jacobean cause. A retreat into the Highlands might have prolonged the war for another year. Certainly the British Army wasn't used to fighting a guerrilla campaign like that as we saw in the Americas. And with hindsight, the civilian cost of a guerrilla war, if the government was to crack down on it, would not have been significantly higher than the civilian cost paid post-Culloden to the Highlanders. So that's my thoughts on the Battle of Culloden. If I'd have been Murray, I'd have been all for taking to the hills and fighting a more guerrilla campaign. If I'd have had overall command, I wouldn't have considered the whole night move attack. I'd have sent a clan of approximately 300, 400 men to harass the British lines. I'd have kept the ground I wanted if I had to fight in Culloden, if Prince Charlie had. And the main route from Nairn to Inverness runs through Culloden Moor, which is why the armies were. I'd have kept that ground. I'd have made sure that my enemy were dispirited, harassed, and I'd have made sure my troops were all fit and ready. And as soon as they were starting to march and form the battle lines, we'd have gone. We wouldn't have given them a chance to form. And even then, I'm not sure that a Jacobite army could have just defeated a government force at then. Because there's other options as well of fighting. There was some stone enclosures. One thing you could have done was used your more regular line troops to defend the enclosures, and did something interesting with a flanking move with your Jacobites, pulling with the Highlanders, pulling the government force against the river, almost a bit like something that Hannibal might have pulled off against a Republican army. But again, I don't think, even with more points in their favour, the Highland army, the Jacobite army, could have won a pitched battle with the government at that point. 8,000 redcoats versus 5,000. If there was anything to be gained from the rebellion going on, in my opinion, it would be take to the hills. So, thank you for watching. Hopefully that's been informative about the Battle of Culloden. And yeah, later on in the week I'll do some more videos doing some miniatures. But I've also got a vast military history, something I know a lot about. So I'll be doing some more videos on military history. But thanks for watching. If you've got any thoughts or comments on Culloden in the 1745, then stick them in the comments. Let's have a discussion about it. But thank you for your time, and I'll catch you again.